This is a book. It is also a lump of charcoal. And if you tried to open it, it would crumble to ash in your hands. For almost 2,000 years, that was the trap. A Roman library was buried by Vesuvius and turned to carbon. 1,800 scrolls, charred solid, the only library to survive whole from the ancient world, and almost none of them could be read. To unroll one was to destroy it, so a team did something stranger. They stopped trying to open them, and read one anyway. Not by unrolling it, by scanning it and teaching a machine to find ink that weighs the same as the page it sits on. And out of the dark, from inside a roll no hand had ever opened, came a single Greek word. In 1750, diggers tunneling through volcanic rock under a hillside near Naples struck the wall of a Roman villa. 2 years later, they reached its library. Inside were roughly 1,800 scrolls, but not as anyone hoped to find them. Vesuvius had charred them solid. They looked like firewood. Some were burned for fuel or thrown away as exactly that. It was a catastrophe wearing the mask of a miracle. The only intact library from the ancient world had come down to us whole and been turned into a box of charcoal. Scholars tried to read it the only way they knew, by opening it. In the 1750s, a Vatican conservator named Antonio Pajo built a machine that peeled a scroll apart with silk threads about a centimeter an hour. It worked after a fashion. It also destroyed a great deal. The early hands tore the opening from nearly every scroll they touched. One came back as crumbs glued to tissue sealed behind glass. So they stopped. Hundreds of scrolls were set aside, still rolled, still unreadable. And for more than 270 years, that is where the word stayed, locked inside by the very thing that had saved them. The man who broke the deadlock is a computer scientist named Brent Seales. His idea sounds impossible. Do not open the scroll. Read it from a 3-dimensional scan while it stays rolled shut. He calls it virtual unwrapping. In 2016, he proved it could work on a different burnt scroll, one charred in a synagogue fire on the shore of the Dead Sea. Its core, a solid black lump. Inside it, untouched, were the opening verses of the book of Leviticus. It worked because that ink was dense, almost metallic. It lit up like bone in an X-ray. Then he turned to her, Q Lane E and hit a wall. Her Q Lane E ink is carbon, soot and water, written on papyrus that Vesuvius had also turned to carbon. Ink and page are now the same material, the same density. In an X-ray, the writing casts almost no shadow at all. They carried the scrolls to particle accelerators, Diamond in England, then the Great Ring in France, and scanned them down to the width of a red blood cell. The scans were flawless. They showed the rolled layers perfectly, and not one letter. The ink was right there, and it was invisible. So the question changed. The ink could not be found by how dense it was, but Seales suspected it left something else behind. A faint roughness where the carbon had soaked into the surface of the page. Not a shadow, a texture, far too subtle for any human eye to catch across a whole scroll of buckled, layered fiber, but perhaps not too subtle for a machine. In 2023, his lab did something a guarded field almost never does. It released the scans to the world, put up a prize, and asked anyone to try. Train a neural network to do one thing. Read the surface of an unopened scroll and flag, speck by speck, where ink is hiding. The problem stopped being physics. It became pattern recognition. For months, it almost worked. The models found marks, faint, broken, ambiguous. Crackle, the entrants called it. You could stare at it, convince yourself you saw a letter, and lose it again. The fear underneath the work was simple, that the method might recover the shape of writing and never an actual word, that the page would surrender its texture and keep its silence, sit for a moment with whose silence it was. The villa is thought to have belonged to Piso, Julius Caesar's father-in-law. The man who built its library was probably a Greek philosopher named Philodemus, who taught that the aim of a life is pleasure, carefully understood. He wrote, and shelved his scrolls, and died, most likely, long before the mountain woke. Then the ash came, his library became a black brick, and his sentences waited in the dark, while empires rose and fell above them. What a neural network was now combing for, speck by speck, was the moment one of those sentences began to speak again. In the autumn of 2023, a student named Luke Farrater was running the models late, and a shape held. 3 Greek letters, then 5, then a whole word. The word was por, F-E, ras, Greek for purple, an ordinary word, caught mid-sentence, and the first ever lifted whole from inside a sealed scroll. Proof the method worked. Within months, the same methods drew more than 2,000 characters out of that single roll. 15 columns of Greek, about 5% of one book. Enough to know what it was, and it was philosophy. An argument about pleasure, whether the things we have in short supply are truly sweeter than the things we have in plenty. A dead man mid-thought, on whether scarcity makes things taste better. 2,000 years late, addressed to no one, and now to us. Which is the moment to stop and ask what we are really holding. This was never about one scroll. In May of 2025, the method did what it had only promised before. It read a title. From inside a still-sealed roll in a library in Oxford, letters resolved into a name and a phrase. A work, the reading suggests, called On Vices by Philodemus. Not a fragment now, a book announcing itself, which means a sealed scroll can be named without ever being opened. The buried thousands stop being a lottery, and that changes what the charred log in your hand really is. It was never the mystery, it was the proof. Because the 1800 scrolls pulled out in the 1750s are not the library, they are what spilled from its edge. Most of the villa is still down there, sealed under 60 feet of rock, beneath a living town, untouched since 2009. By one estimate, the room still buried could hold tens of thousands of scrolls. That is a guess, not a count. No one has reached far enough to know, and no one needs to open a single one of them anymore. Scholars let themselves dream of what waits in that dark. A lost play, a vanished history, a poem of Sappho's. They may be wrong. Everything read so far is Philodemus, patiently arguing about pleasure. But for the first time, the dream is no longer blocked by the reading. It is only blocked by the digging. So hold it again, the black, almost weightless cylinder that looks like nothing at all. It is a man's voice, folded into carbon, waiting. For 270 years, the only way to read it was to destroy it. Now we can listen without breaking it open. Philodemus, somewhere in the dark, still finishing his sentence about pleasure, to an audience he could never have pictured. Most of his library is still beneath the town, unread and undug, and the only thing between us and it now is whether we choose to reach for it. There is one more library the fire was meant to erase, and saved instead. Far to the east, when Nineveh burned, the flames baked its clay tablets hard as brick, and preserved a library older than this one in the ash of its own destruction. We'll walk it next. I'm June, and this has been The Hour, where we keep a light on for the things the world almost lost.